All right, and I'd like this to be, as much as a conversation as we can. So feel free to, as we're going through, to ask questions. You can either, call them out or use the chat. Ingrid and Ashley are going to kind of monitor the chat for me a bit, since I can't see that while I'm sharing my screen. But we're briefly going to go over 10,000 degrees, which we all pretty much know since we're here, but talk about that. And then AVID, what it is, some of its goals and the lingo they use. Then we're going to jump into some classroom scenarios, specifically some AVID volunteers I always mention are a little bit tricky. And then we'll talk about some volunteer opportunities and other resources about AVID. So just to start off, 10,000 degrees. Our mission is to achieve educational equity and to support students from low-income backgrounds to and through college to positively impact their communities and the world. We envision a world where all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background, will have a full range of educational opportunities, support, and resources to realize their full potential. And this ties in a lot with AVID and their goals, as we'll see in a minute. Our little neck of the woods out of 10,000 degrees, the academic support group, we work with community volunteers, like all of you, training, placing, and supporting volunteers in classrooms, Title I classrooms in Novato, San Rafael, Sausalito, Marin City, and Shoreline school districts in support of 10,000 degrees mission. We are in classrooms K through 12, although for AVID, it's a high school program where we have volunteers. We are in 26 schools and 130 classrooms. We have over 200 volunteers, and most of our volunteers have been with us 4 or 5 years, although as some of the people on this Zoom can attest, others have been with us for more than 10 years. The approach we take in the classroom as a volunteer is a strength-based practice. So it's very student-centered. We're working on a mentality of a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. So we believe each student has the capacity for growth and for change. As such, we're focused on existing strengths of the students and overcoming challenges and encouraging positive change. As part of that, it's very much a two-way dynamic. It's not a top-down, we're the adult, we have all the knowledge that we're going to impart to the student. It's much more of a collaborative process. So getting into AVID. AVID stands for Advancement via Individual Determination. And its mission is to close the opportunity gap by preparing all students for college and success for college readiness and success in a global society. It's a national organization. The AVID system was actually developed in 1980 by a high school teacher in San Diego. It became a nonprofit in 1992. And today the system is in 47 states, 7,500 schools. And the organization trains 85,000 educators annually. So it is part of a bigger system than just the AVID class. Its core competencies are teaching critical thinking, inquiry, self-advocacy, and cooperation. And the teaching approach really shifts from delivering content to facilitating learning. And this leads to an inquiry-based, student-centric classroom. The class is an elective class, so students choose to take it. It's offered 9th through 12th grade, and often the students do stay in it all 4 years and are in a cohort with the same students. And there are kind of two parts of it. There is a college readiness part where they are talking about colleges, helping students think about what their strengths are, what their interests are. They might visit a college or two to see what a campus is and get them in that college mindset. Then there's also the tutorial part, which is where the volunteers come in. And the teachers at each school do a training for all the volunteers. So you're not just put in blindly, you know the process and what to expect. I'm going to just run through in kind of a nutshell what it is. And this is repeat for some of you, for others it will be new. But for the tutorial portion, the students, before they come to class, they complete what they call a tutorial request form, this TRF, where they're looking at something in an academic class that they have a question about, or what they call a point of confusion. And they really need to think about this, that they go through, they look at what vocabulary is used in my topic and my question, and what do I know about it, what don't I know, so they can really think about where is their confusion, where does that come from. Once then they're in the class, they are in a small group with a volunteer, and the students take turns. Each one will present their point of confusion. They call it a 30-second speech. And it's usually on a whiteboard where they're writing out what their point of confusion. And then the students and the volunteers go around and are asking questions to help guide the student through the critical thinking process, and help them kind of figure out how to work through their point of confusion. Once they've gone through that and they have their solution, then they write a reflection on not just answering their question, but how did I get there? And so that's how they're really looking at what were the steps and what did I discover through this process? So as an AVID volunteer, your role is to facilitate the questioning and the interaction between the presenter and the group members. And you want to push the thinking to a higher level through inquiry. So some things to keep in mind. You're expected to be an active learner, not an expert. So it's okay not to know the answer. It's okay not to know the subject matter, which I know is really kind of daunting for adults, because we like to be in control and we like to know the situation ahead of time. And so it is challenging to be in a group talking about chemistry if you don't know chemistry, but that's okay. You don't need to know it. Also, silence is okay. You know, it's good to ask questions, but then you want to let it kind of sit there. The students need that to be able to process the information, but that's also how you can get more interaction. And then also learning the process is part of the goal. So if in your time in tutorial, the student doesn't come up with the answer, that's okay. The point is the process of them learning about what can I do to solve this. And in doing that, you also need to kind of celebrate any small victories you have in the class. The process makes it sound very straightforward of you do this and you do this and you do this and voila, everybody is clear. And it doesn't always happen that way. So one AVID teacher shared with me at the beginning of the year, she has, for each class, she has a small goal. And in the beginning of the year, it's, everybody shows up with paper and pencil and we go from there. So, so you got to kind of take the wins where you can. All right, I see there are a few things in the chat. Any conversations come up?
No, I think we're good, Kim.
We're good, okay.
If I can ask a question,
Yes.
and you'll cover it. So when the students are grouped in class, would you as a volunteer, might you have a student with a math question and another with a science and another with a social studies that you're trying to solve at the same time?
Yeah, typically not. So the teacher usually goes through the TRFs, the little the sheets the students fill out that have their point of confusion. She reviews those before the class and groups them. So the math questions, people with math questions, and the kids are in the same grade. So for the most part, they're in the same level class. But so she does try and kind of group, okay, here's the algebra, here's the algebra questions, here are the humanity questions. Ingrid and Ashley, does that seem accurate to you? Is that how it usually works out?
Yeah, so usually it's very math focused. There's several types of math. So you have that, but then you have kind of the outliers, like the language arts might get mashed together with history, but I've never seen more than 2 subjects.
That's been my experience as well, or what I've found is that I'm typically in a group with students with math, and it's exclusively math. So yeah, the teacher does try to group according to subject matter.
Great. Okay. So how do you get students to, how do you raise the level of critical thinking and inquiry? And so there are basically 3 levels of critical thinking, 3 levels of inquiry. Level 1 is kind of the most basic, and that's where the students are just gathering and recalling information. So questions based at this level are very concrete. So what do you know about the problem? What does it say in the textbook or your notes about this? Which may sound like a basic question, but it's actually very good as far as executive function and organization, and getting the kids to look back at their notes, because often the answer is there. So that's a really important question. Also, is there a formula or mnemonic device to help you know what the steps are? Okay. Level 2, the next level up, is when they're processing the information. So they're trying to make sense of the information and make any connections. So you might ask, can you break down the question? Can you find a problem similar to this? Or what is the relationship between this part of the question and this part of the question? And then the 3rd level, which is the highest level, is where the students are applying and evaluating actions and solutions. So helping students apply whatever knowledge they've figured out by making connections, or by really processing and organizing the information, and then trying to make connections in kind of a bigger sense. So you could ask them, does this answer make sense? How do you know? Is there another way you could have solved this problem? Is there a real life situation that this would apply to? Or can you walk us through these steps in your own words? If they're at the level they can explain how to solve a problem in their own words, they probably have a pretty good understanding of the concepts behind it. Okay. So now we're going to jump in and actually look at some scenarios that volunteers have seen in their groups and look at how you can solve them. So Ingrid is going to present this first scenario.
So this scenario is, I'll read it here. You're working with a group of 4 or 5 students. Often your group has point of confusion centered around the book that they're reading for English. But today the question's about geometry, subject you probably don't remember much from high school. So this happens almost every Tuesday when I'm in class, because they're 10th graders and most of them have geometry or algebra, which I don't remember anything of. And I'm usually in those groups. And so, yeah, I find that actually not knowing the subject sometimes maybe actually helps me, because I am not making any assumptions that the students might know something, because I know nothing. So when you're in the group, as it says there on the screen, the burden of the work is on the students and not the volunteer. So really the other students in the group should be asking questions to the person with the point of confusion. And as Kim mentioned earlier, one of the first things that's important to do is to ask the students to look in their notes or book if they have an answer or the formula is in there. Just on Tuesday, I was in a geometry group, which, yeah, I don't remember much geometry, but the student's point of confusion was just, how do I find the base? And then he wrote, you know, put it up on the board and some numbers and a shape, and I was clueless. And so the first question I asked was, what shape is that? And he's like, I think a trapezoid. And I was like, well, okay, maybe. And the rest of the students were able to affirm it was a trapezoid. But just starting with some basic questions, because I need to clarify myself that I can follow along. So that I think is super important, that you make sure you're understanding. As I'm asking, like, is there a formula? And then when the student realized he did have a trapezoid in front of him, he looked in his notes, found that there was a formula for the trapezoid. And then he was able to work through it with that. And also encouraging participation from the students. Sometimes the students will just look at me to help the student presenter out. And if we're in a geometry group, then that obviously everyone has geometry. So I encourage them, like, how do you guys, you know, is this the right direction that the student is going? Is there a formula? You know, because those students know more than I do, and they can often lead to asking questions to help the students solve it. But the big part of AVID is you don't give the answer. So you're not expected to know geometry. You're supposed to help lead them to find the answer on their own. And that's kind of the big takeaway from that. So shouldn't be too intimidated by not knowing the subject, because you're just asking lots of questions. And so once the problem is solved, having the student go back over the steps, asking them, does this answer make sense? Because sometimes the answer doesn't make sense and I can't figure it out. I'm like, where did this number come from? Show me again, you know, how you got that number. And sometimes we'll find a mistake. Sometimes it's just me not knowing the subject, and they can show me how to do the problem. Yeah. Questions?
Great. Thanks, Ingrid. That was really, that made it really clear. So thank you. Okay. So our next scenario, Ashley is going to talk about.
All right, so we got scenario 2 here. You're working on an algebra problem with your group. They're making progress, but you sense that they're just following the steps from a previous example and not understanding the concepts. What do you do? All right. I just this past week was doing work with sophomores with my group, and I think I experienced something very similar to this. So to go through the slide here, move students through the levels of inquiry. Level 1, gathering info. What do you know about your problem? It's interesting, the students, we were working with exponents, and they knew the rules, and they get confident and they get going quick. And I started putting up, you know, we were working on the problems they had. And then it was interesting, they got so focused on the exponents that they kind of forgot basic rules of they were applying rules of exponents to fractions. And so that was kind of my real life experience of that. So to help them, we backed up, and breaking it into the smaller parts was kind of what got us through. So I kind of we independently, through questioning, I'd say, okay, let's focus on the exponents. What do you know? What are the rules you know? And how can you apply them here? And then separating kind of the exponent part of the problem from just the number part of the problem. So breaking it into the smaller parts was key for us there. But it is interesting, they were so keen because they had kind of got this exponent, but they kind of, you know, then get blocked in that kind of vision of how to do that they kind of forget holistically what the problem was. So, and so once we did that, and then applying the knowledge and making connections, I think the most useful point of these I found, some certain problems in math, you can go back through and know if the answer is correct by just almost, reworking the problem. But I think teaching it to a friend, and I find that's been the most, is I'll get to have them up in front of the class and explain, can you teach to, everyone else in the group how you got this. So I think that's the most useful one I've found in a math scenario. And is there another way to solve this? Can this method work for other problems? Real life situation, that one's a little trickier in a algebra scenario. But I think the key for them was really kind of questioning them and getting them to break it down into smaller parts, and then teaching it to the rest of the group to kind of reinforce that they had a comprehension of it and weren't just, doing one problem after the next and kind of thinking they had understood it when they kind of lost the big picture. So.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I find with math, I think in particular, it's easy. Students can get kind of caught up in the rules and going through that, but then don't actually know what they're doing. So that's good if you then have them teach it to someone else. That kind of shows that they do have a higher level of understanding.
Yes.
Okay, so the next scenario. So largely the groups are math or science, it seems like, but there are some, as I think Ingrid said, some outliers of humanities. I know there's a group, at least at Terralina, that's consistently social studies and history, and there are some English questions, so you can kind of be prepared for different topics. But so in this English scenario, the students are discussing To Kill a Mockingbird and are stating obvious facts, but not getting into any themes or deeper issues. You're tempted to point out the main character's development throughout the book. Should you do this? So as we talked about before, no, you do not want to do that. Your job is to ask the questions instead of giving the answers. So it might seem obvious to you, but you need to find a way for the students to get there. So you can ask, does Scout change throughout the book? If so, how? Or how did this event shape the character? Things like that to get them to make their own conclusions. Another way you can have the students really kind of digging deeper into the book is have them as a group find an important passage in the book and annotate it together as a group. You can also help the students by showing different ways to connect with the text. So you can have them connect to themselves, like on a personal level. Can they relate to the main character, to Scout, or maybe to her father or her sibling or another character, or an action that happens in the book? You can ask them how the text relates to itself. So how is the book structured, and how does that change it? Is it written in first person, and how does that affect it? Is it written in rhyme? Things like that. Another way is relating the text to another text. So either another book that they've written, that they've read, or a movie, or any form of media. My high school daughter, she's not in AVID, but she's reading the Odyssey. And the other day at dinner, she was talking about how the Odyssey is very similar to High School Musical, which is not a connection I would have come up with at all. She did make a pretty compelling argument. So, just letting them kind of connect it to things that they know is very valuable, and you don't know what you're going to come up with. Oops, wait a minute, I backed up by mistake. And then the last way is having them look at the text in a big context. So in the world, what does this book say about our community or our world or this point in history? And so they can then see it in a broader context. Okay, and our last scenario, Ingrid is going to talk about this one.
All right, so scenario 4. Your group has gone through all their questions and there's still 20 minutes left in class. What do you do? And this does happen, maybe not a full 20 minutes, but certainly I do have time often. So you can ask a few higher level questions, go back to some of the math problems, maybe try plugging in different numbers and seeing if they can solve it that way. You can also, students are supposed to complete a reflection after the tutorial. And the reflection, it's a sheet of paper that they fill out, and you can have them do that and share their reflection out. And the reflection talks about how their point of confusion, how they got to an answer, if they got to an answer, and kind of an overall, what did they think about, what was going on. What I like to do most often is the third point here is use the time to connect with the students, ask them about their weekend, just overall, how's school, how are things going. I was a high school teacher before, so find it super important to make, some kind of connection with the students. So you aren't just some, strange adult that comes in once a week and tries to help them out in class. You can also move on to an upcoming topic. If you know what they might be working on ahead of time, like for history, when I do history, because I taught 10th grade history, I know that, okay, after Russian Revolution, we'll be talking about this. And so we'll kind of do some foreshadowing about what will be coming up and see if they can guess about what might come up. And also pull up a Khan Academy video, maybe for one of the math questions that could clarify something that you were talking about. But also ask the students, again, this is really connecting with them about their college or career aspirations or what they've been doing in AVID. The 10th graders will be doing some research on colleges and ask about, what colleges are you looking at and why are you looking at that? When they're juniors, they generally go and visit some schools. You can ask about that. And again, trying to just get to know the students, I think, is super important. So you aren't, again, that strange adult that pops in once a week.
Yeah. Ashley, does that ring true to you? Do you have any other tips for what to do if you have lots of time left over?
Yes, it does. I think top one for me too. And often as kids are filtering in, I do just try to get to know them on a personal basis. Oops, sorry. Whether it's, I was talking to the boys at Terraland about soccer because many of them were on the soccer team. So I find that's extremely helpful just to kind of have some kind of connection. And then also with extra time, perhaps if they have a test coming up, like I said, I usually am doing math. Or we'll end up just working additional problems, or I'll create problems and along, the lines of what we've been working on during tutorial. If everyone gets through their points of confusion, I'll write up problems on the board and then they'll work on those. I'm not sure if that's necessarily student led. Maybe I should have them make it.
Yeah, really have them come up with questions.
But this has been helpful for me. I mean, I'm learning as we go as well. And one big thing I've just learned is my body position, because sometimes I walk into the room and I don't know, I would stand in front and I'm like, wait, I need to stand in the back. I know it's kind of obvious, but it's something I'm personally still working on, because I don't know, it just, let them be the leaders and have it centered around them and not me. So
right. Yeah. And I think also as volunteers, you all have a special have an opportunity for kind of a different relationship with the kids than the teachers. So for a lot of the kids, school, for them, school's really challenging and maybe anxiety inducing. And for for you to be working them as a volunteer, you're kind of a neutral, more neutral party. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of have that relationship with them, that they might be more willing to open up or be a little more vulnerable of, I think this, but I'm not sure, without some of the pressure that, working with the teacher may induce. So great. Thank you for that. So are there any questions, or has anybody come up with any possible scenarios that we didn't cover?
I have a quick question, sort of a two-part question. One, I am curious what either Ashley or Ingrid, what challenges have you come across while you've been in the classroom with the students? And then sort of the second part is, since it's an elective for these young people, I'm assuming they're all relatively participatory, or is that not necessarily the case? Just want to sort of get a sense about both of those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. Good questions. Now, either of you want to tackle that?
I'll chime in. Just
Yeah.
Yesterday, I have juniors and they were introduced to trigonometry, and they walk in. I said, what is your point of confusion? They all just on their papers, it was a little sparse, and they're like, trigonometry. I'm like, okay. That was challenging because I didn't have much to work with because their points of confusion were very brief and short. But we got through it, I think, just once again, referring back to the sources we had and vocabulary, and kind of working from basics and having them come up, essentially teach me, like, assume I don't know trigonometry. What have you learned thus far, even though they had only been just introduced to the topic that day. So that was challenging, just I think finding sometimes that there's silence, or they don't have a point of confusion. I think that's been a challenging scenario, which we've worked through with some hiccups along the way. But
yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry.
I think that's one of those things. Ideally, everybody walks into class with a well-written point of confusion. Obviously, that it's not always ideal. So there are times when kids either don't have one, or it's just really, really brief and needs to get fleshed out. And I think that's harkens back to that this is a process, and so it's not always going to be ideal, and kind of you start where you are and just try and move it forward as much as you can. And so even if they come in without a full-fledged question, Ashley, I think sounds like did a good job of being like, okay, let's back up. Let's, here's what we have. What can you tell me? And go on from there. All right, Ingrid, did you have something to say on that? And then we'll get to Jillian. Looks like she's raised her hand.
So I've definitely experienced that as being a difficult situation. Something else, and this is just part of being in the classroom, is the kids kind of being squirrely and not, just being a little squirrely. And with that, I'm able to get the students in check for the most part. I mean, they aren't doing anything bad. It's just high school kids. I think the question was also, because it's an elective, do the students want to be there? They definitely should want to be there. That isn't always the case. And I think they do kind of get exited out of the program if they're not sticking with it or really showing no interest. So definitely by the juniors and seniors, they should be all in.
So Jillian, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. So do you start each class by saying, what is the point of confusion? Or I'm just unclear on how a class, on the structure of the class.
The most kids I usually have is 6. And when we get in there, I'll ask for just, a volunteer, like who would like to go first and present their point of confusion. I typically, with the older kids, they will be willing and volunteer. Sometimes it requires me to call on them, but then we will just cycle through each individual. They present their point of confusion. We discuss, work through the problem. They sit down. Meanwhile, the other students are taking notes while engaging and asking questions. And then the next student goes. And ideally, yes, they volunteer themselves, but sometimes I do have to call on them to go.
Great, thank you.
So at San Rafael, it's a block period. And so the first half hour, the teacher collects everyone's point of confusion questions and then sorts them into groups. And then I come in the last hour along with a couple other volunteers. And so the class of, I don't know, maybe 30 students is divided into approximately 5 or 6 groups. And a volunteer then works with some of those groups. So it does sometimes get kind of noisy because we're all in there and everyone's talking, but that's what it looks like in the class I'm in.
So you talked about what do you do if you have time left over. Have you encountered situations where it's going the other way? Do you have to play timekeeper sometimes to make sure you get around to every student?
Oh, good question. No, Ingrid and Ashley, have you ever not gotten to everybody who had a question? Like, it's just one question takes too long?
Yeah, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think necessarily, especially sometimes if there's 6 students, it's at least the classes I've been in, that's okay. The teachers don't expect necessarily that everyone got it.
Yeah, I think, sometimes you can ask this, have each student just quickly read their question and kind of see if there are commonalities. Like 3 people have basically the same question, so let's go with this. Or I've seen sometimes they might ask like, okay, who has a test first, or something like that. If someone has, a more urgency than others. So, Lisa, did you have your
Yeah,
do you
I
have a
just had a
question?
question. Is there a typical first AVID student? Is it more? Does it tend to be first generation students, or just curious about the population, who self-selects to apply?
So, so Ingrid and Ashley may have more specifics on this, but I believe at San Rafael and Terra Linda, they are targeting, first generation kids that definitely have the ability to go into college, but where college might not be on their radar. So there is some, some guidance from teachers or guidance counselors to try and steer them into that classroom. That being said, I know there are other students that are in AVID who are not first generation, so they might try and
That's great.
make a mix. Mm-hmm. Does that, Ingrid and Ashley, does that sound accurate?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, great questions. Let's see. Ooh, let's see if we can move on. Oh, let's see. How did I get? My presentation got moved along. All right. There we go. Okay, so now I'm backtracked. Okay, so I don't know how to get back. Okay, here we go. So so AVID in schools. So as we've talked about, it is at San Rafael High. The classes meet Tuesdays and Thursdays throughout the day, depending on if it's 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. So at 9 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2:10 are all times when they have tutorial, and volunteers are still needed. There's space. Terra Linda High, they meet Tuesdays at 2:45 and Wednesdays at 1:30. Wednesdays, they're 2 different classes. That's why it's an hour and a half. They do have AVID at TAM, and as Deborah mentioned, they're looking at that for Shoreline. At this point, I don't think they're taking volunteers, but maybe in the future. So if it's something in the fall you want to look at, and as I mentioned, this I really just did a nutshell training of the process. So at the schools, the the AVID coordinators meet with all the volunteers and kind of go in more depth on the process. So everybody's kind of prepared when they get into the classroom. After this presentation, I'll be sending out an email that will have some of the resources we talked about. AVID as an organization is at avid.org. You can actually see videos of tutorials in action on YouTube. If you just do a search for AVID tutorial, there are a bunch that come up. Some are teachers talking about it. Some are, they just set the camera on the tutorial and they're like, 15 minutes of a student walking through a problem, and you see the volunteer taking notes and the kids asking questions and all that. Also, I'll attach a document outlining the levels of inquiry in more depth and just more questions you can ask at each level. And then also I'll include a flow chart on the process. In a nutshell, I kind of did it in 3 steps, but it's actually much more drawn out. I think actually it's the official one is 10 steps from pre-tutorial, tutorial, after tutorial, but a nice little flow chart on the process. So I will include that. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can all look at each other. Yes, thank you very much. All right. Well, good. Well, if there are no more questions or comments, we can all sign off and enjoy the rest of your day.